A racist flight attendant slapped a black CEO kid, and a few moments later, the boy's response shocked the entire airline, and everyone started looking at what was about to unfold. "How dare you talk back to me?" The flight attendant, a middle-aged white woman named Susan Richardson, stood over Julian with her hands still raised, her face twisted with rage. "Little boys like you need to learn respect." Julian's eyes watered from the sting, but he didn't cry. He stood there in his pressed button-down shirt and tailored blazer, his weekend bag at his feet, processing what had just happened. Around him, first-class passengers stared with their mouths open, phones already being pulled out, but nobody speaking, nobody intervening. He'd only asked a simple question. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you gave me the wrong drink. I ordered apple juice, and this is orange juice." That was it. That was all it took for Susan Richardson to decide this well-dressed, polite black child needed to be physically assaulted in front of a plane full of witnesses. "You don't get to make demands," Susan hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from Julian's. "You don't get to question what I give you. You take what you're given and say thank you. Do you understand me?" Julian touched his burning cheek, his mind racing. He'd been raised by parents who taught him to stand up for himself, to speak truth to power, to never accept injustice quietly. His mother, a federal judge, had drilled into him the importance of knowing his rights. His father, a senior advisor to the President of the United States, had taught him that words could be more powerful than any physical force. And in that moment, as Susan Richardson stood over him, waiting for him to cower, waiting for him to apologize for daring to correct her mistake, Julian made a decision that would change everything. He straightened his blazer, looked Susan Richardson directly in the eyes, and opened his mouth to deliver a response that would leave the entire cabin speechless, that would go viral within hours, that would cost Susan Richardson everything she had, and that would prove that even an 11-year-old could stand against racism with devastating eloquence. But before he could speak, Susan raised her hand again. "Don't you even think about—" "Ma'am." Julian's voice cut through her threat, calm and clear and carrying an authority that made grown adults sit up straighter. "You just committed assault and battery against a minor on a commercial aircraft. That's a federal offense. You did it in front of approximately 40 witnesses. 12 of them are currently recording on their phones. And you did it because I politely pointed out that you gave me the wrong beverage." The cabin went from silent to dead quiet. Susan's hand lowered slowly, her face shifting from rage to uncertainty as Julian's words registered. "Now," Julian continued, his 11-year-old voice steady despite the tears still threatening to fall, despite the handprint burning on his face, "you have two choices. You can apologize right now, admit you made a terrible mistake, and we can try to handle this with some dignity. Or you can continue to threaten me, and I can make a phone call that will end your career before this plane even takes off." Susan's laugh was nervous now, not confident. "You think you can threaten me? You're a child. Who are you going to call? Your mommy?" Julian pulled out his phone, and the look on his face made Susan take a step back. "Actually," Julian said quietly, "I was thinking about calling my father. His name is Marcus Carter. Perhaps you've heard of him? He's the senior advisor to the president and heads the Department of Transportation Oversight Committee. The same committee that regulates airlines and investigates incidents of passenger assault and discrimination." The color drained from Susan's face like someone had pulled a plug. And every passenger in that cabin understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Now, let me ask you something that will cut straight to your soul. Have you ever watched an adult put their hands on a child, assault them, humiliate them, all because that child dared to speak up politely? Ever seen a black child treated like they deserve violence for the crime of existing with confidence? If you think slapping an 11-year-old for asking for the right drink is acceptable, if you believe children should accept abuse from adults in authority, then this story isn't for you. But if you know deep in your bones that what Susan Richardson just did is criminal, that racism gives people the audacity to assault children and expect no consequences, then you need to watch until the very end. Drop your experiences in the comments. When have you seen adults assault black children and get away with it? When have you witnessed this kind of violence disguised as discipline? Hit that like button if you stand against child abuse and racial violence. Share this video because people need to see how racism operates even against children. And subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel because what Julian Carter is about to say will leave you speechless. This 11-year-old is about to teach an entire airplane about courage, about dignity, and about what happens when you underestimate a child who knows his worth. Susan Richardson has no idea what storm she just unleashed. And justice is coming in words so powerful they'll echo for years. Julian Carter had been looking forward to this weekend for 3 months. Ever since his best friend Michael had invited him to his family's lake house in Michigan for a weekend of fishing, video games, and the kind of freedom that came from being 11 years old and temporarily free from the watchful eyes of Secret Service agents and political scrutiny. Julian's life wasn't typical for a 6th grader. While other kids worried about homework and soccer practice, Julian navigated a world of security clearances, political dinners, and the constant awareness that his father's position meant every action, every word, every mistake would be scrutinized. Marcus Carter, his father, had risen through the ranks of government service over 20 years, eventually becoming one of the most trusted advisors to the president, specifically overseeing transportation policy and airlines safety regulations. His mother, Judge Simone Carter, sat on the Federal District Court for D.C., known for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to civil rights law. She'd made national headlines twice for rulings that protected voting rights and challenged discriminatory housing practices. Julian had inherited both parents' intelligence and their unshakable sense of justice. At 11, he read at a college level, participated in junior debate competitions, and had already started thinking about law school the way other kids thought about summer vacation. But more than his academic achievements, Julian had inherited his parents' backbone, that refusal to bow to injustice even when bowing would be easier. That morning, his mother had braided his hair into neat cornrows before driving him to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. "You remember everything we talked about?" Simone had asked, adjusting the collar of his blazer for the 3rd time. "Yes, Mom." "Stay with Michael's family at all times. Check in every night. Don't post anything on social media without asking first. And if anyone gives you trouble?" His mother's eyes had gone serious in that way that meant this was important. "I speak up respectfully but firmly. I know my rights. And I call you or Dad immediately if something feels wrong." Simone had kissed his forehead. "You're so grown up, baby. Sometimes I forget you're only 11. "Almost 12, Julian had corrected with a grin, making her laugh. Now, standing in the first-class cabin of United Flight 2456 with a handprint burning on his face, Julian wished his mother were there. But he'd spent his entire life watching his parents handle injustice with grace and power, and he'd learned from the best. The first-class cabin was a study in luxury. Wide leather seats that reclined into beds, ambient lighting that shifted from warm gold to cool blue, and personal entertainment screens at every seat. It smelled like expensive cologne and fresh coffee, the kind of space designed for comfort and exclusivity. Julian's ticket had been a gift from his father, an upgrade from economy because Marcus wanted his son's first solo flight to be special. Susan Richardson had been a flight attendant for United Airlines for 17 years. She'd started when the job still carried a certain prestige, when flight attendants were expected to maintain a specific appearance, a specific demeanor, a specific understanding of who belonged in first class and who didn't. Over the years, she'd watched the demographics of premium cabin passengers shift, and she'd resented every moment of it. She'd developed a radar for passengers who, in her mind, didn't fit. Passengers who were too young, too casual, too ethnic. She'd perfected the art of subtle discrimination, questioning boarding passes just a little more thoroughly for certain passengers, offering beverages with just a little less warmth, and enforcing rules just a little more strictly. Usually it worked. Usually, passengers accepted the microaggressions, filed complaints that went nowhere, or simply didn't recognize the differential treatment for what it was. But Julian Carter wasn't a usual passenger. And when he'd politely pointed out her mistake with the beverage, his confidence, his articulateness, his refusal to be diminished had triggered something ugly in Susan. How dare this black child speak to her as an equal? How dare he correct her? How dare he act like he belonged in first class, dressed in expensive clothes, carrying himself with the kind of self-assurance she'd spent 17 years trying to strip from passengers who looked like him. So she'd slapped him. In front of witnesses. On camera. With such casual cruelty, it suggested this wasn't the first time she'd lashed out at passengers, just the first time she'd been stupid enough to do it where it couldn't be hidden. Around them, the other first-class passengers represented a cross-section of America. Business travelers in suits, tapping away on laptops. A retired couple heading to visit grandchildren. A young family with a toddler who'd been fussing before Julian's confrontation provided a more interesting distraction. Most were white, comfortable, accustomed to the privilege of first-class travel. And now they were all witnesses to a moment that would define whether they were complicit or courageous, whether they would speak up or stay silent, whether they would protect a child or protect their comfort. Julian could feel their eyes on him, could sense the phone's recording, could practically hear the mental calculations people were making about whether to intervene or mind their own business. His cheek throbbed where Susan had struck him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to call his parents, to let the adults handle this, to be the child he technically still was. But his parents had raised him to understand that childhood didn't excuse injustice, that being young didn't mean being powerless, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to be a victim even when the world expected you to be one. Susan Richardson stood in front of him, her confidence returning now that the initial shock of Julian's response had faded. She'd heard threats before from passengers who claimed they'd sue, who promised to get her fired, who swore she'd regret her behavior. Nothing ever came of it. Complaints disappeared into HR black holes. Passengers moved on with their lives. And Susan kept her job, kept her seniority, kept her ability to make people she deemed unworthy feel small. She had no idea that this time was different. That this child she just assaulted wasn't just smart and articulate. He was the son of the man who literally oversaw airline regulation policy. The son of a federal judge who specialized in civil rights violations. The son of parents who'd taught him not just to know his rights but to defend them with precision and power. "Go ahead and make your little phone call," Susan said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure your father will be very upset. But I've been doing this job for 17 years, and I know how these things work. By the time you land, you'll have forgotten all about this. And I'll still be here, doing my job, maintaining standards on this aircraft." Julian's finger hovered over his father's contact. One call and this would be over. One call and adults would take control, would handle things, would protect him the way children were supposed to be protected. But something stopped him. Some understanding that this moment was bigger than just him, that how he handled this would matter not just for his own dignity but for every black child who'd faced similar treatment and had no power to fight back. So instead of calling his father, Julian did something that would be replayed millions of times across social media, studied in conflict resolution classes, and quoted in articles about standing up to discrimination. He started talking. And the words that came out of his 11-year-old mouth would shock everyone within earshot. Julian lowered his phone and looked Susan Richardson directly in the eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried through the cabin with a clarity that made every conversation stop, every passenger lean forward, every phone angle itself to capture what was about to happen. "Before I make that call, I want you to understand something, ma'am. You didn't just slap me because I corrected your mistake about the drink. You slapped me because you saw a black child in first class who spoke with confidence, who dressed well, who carried himself like he belonged here. And that made you uncomfortable. That challenged your idea of who deserves respect and who deserves violence." Susan's face flushed. "How dare you accuse me of racism? This has nothing to do with race. This is about a disrespectful child who—" I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you gave me the wrong drink," Julian interrupted, his voice still calm but gaining steel. "Those were my exact words. Polite, respectful, accurate. And your response was to physically assault me. So let me ask you, ma'am, would you have slapped a white child for saying those same words?" The silence that followed was deafening. Susan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, because they both knew the answer. Everyone in that cabin knew the answer. "That's what I thought," Julian continued. See, you're not just a flight attendant who made a mistake. You're an adult who believes she has the right to put her hands on a child because that child is black and dared to speak up. You're someone who's probably done this before in smaller ways, to passengers who didn't have the vocabulary to fight back or the confidence to challenge you. That's not true. Susan's voice rose, defensive now, desperate. I treat all passengers equally. I've been doing this job for 17 years. I have an exemplary record. Then you won't mind when we review that record, Julian said quietly. When we look at passenger complaints. When we examine the pattern of how you treat white passengers versus passengers of color. When we investigate whether this is truly the first time you've let your prejudice turn violent. A businessman in seat 2C spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. I watched the whole thing. The kid was nothing but polite. She gave him orange juice instead of apple juice, he pointed it out nicely, and she lost it. Started yelling at him about respect and talking back. That's when she hit him. Other passengers began nodding, murmuring agreement. The witnesses were finding their voices now, emboldened by Julian's courage, ashamed perhaps that an 11-year-old had to defend himself while they'd sat silent. Everyone here saw it, an elderly woman added. That poor child did nothing wrong. Nothing. Susan looked around the cabin, seeing her support evaporating, seeing the phones recording her humiliation, seeing the career she'd protected for 17 years crumbling around her. Her panic was transforming into something uglier, that rage that comes when people feel cornered and exposed. You think you're so smart, Susan hissed at Julian, all pretense of professionalism gone now. You think because you can use big words and wear nice clothes that you're better than you are. But I see through it. I see what you really are. And what's that, ma'am? Julian asked, his voice steady despite the tears now sliding down his cheeks, despite the fear making his hands shake, despite being 11 years old and facing down an adult who clearly hated him. Susan stopped herself, but the slur was there in her eyes, in her curled lip, in the venom dripping from her silence. Julian nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd always known. Thank you for making it clear. Now, everyone in this cabin understands exactly who you are. Not a frustrated flight attendant. Not someone having a bad day. But someone who looks at a black child and sees something deserving of violence. Someone who thinks racial slurs, even if she's smart enough not to say them out loud. Someone who should never be in a position of authority over vulnerable passengers. He raised his phone again. Now I'm going to make 2 calls. The first is to my father, who, as I mentioned, oversees airline safety and regulation policy for the federal government. The second is to my mother, who is a federal judge and will be very interested in filing charges for assault and battery against a minor, child endangerment, and a civil rights violation under federal law. Susan's face went from red to white. Wait, please. I didn't mean, you're exaggerating what happened. It was barely a tap. A tap. Julian's voice rose for the first time, emotion finally breaking through his controlled exterior. You hit me hard enough to leave a mark. You did it in front of witnesses. You did it because you thought I was powerless. Because you thought a black child traveling alone wouldn't have anyone to protect him. His voice cracked on the last word, and the sound of an 11-year-old's pain cut through every defense mechanism, every excuse, every justification Susan had been constructing. But here's what you didn't know, Julian continued, his voice dropping back to that devastating calm. You didn't know that my parents taught me I have value, that my voice matters, that I don't have to accept abuse from anyone, no matter how much authority they think they have. You didn't know that I'm not powerless. And you definitely didn't know that hitting me was going to be the biggest mistake of your career. He pressed the dial on his father's number, and the phone started ringing on speaker, each ring like a countdown to Susan Richardson's professional execution. Around them, passengers held their breath, phones still recording, witnessing a moment that felt historic, watching an 11-year-old black child refuse to be a victim and daring to demand justice in real time. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And everyone in that cabin understood that when Marcus Carter answered, everything was about to change. Have you ever watched a child have to defend themselves against an adult's violence while other adults just watched? Have you seen an 11-year-old display more courage and composure than the grown people around him? Julian Carter is standing alone in front of 40 witnesses, most of whom stayed silent while he was assaulted, and he's teaching every one of them a lesson about dignity. But here's the question nobody wants to answer. Why did it take a child's courage to make adults speak up? Julian. Marcus Carter's voice came through the phone speaker, instantly recognizable to anyone who watched political news. Deep, authoritative, the voice that had testified before Congress dozens of times, that had briefed presidents, that commanded respect in the highest levels of government. Son, you're supposed to text when you board. Everything okay? The cabin went absolutely silent. Several passengers' eyes went wide with recognition. The businessman in 2C pulled out his phone, frantically Googling, then looked up at Julian with shock written across his face. Dad, Julian's voice trembled slightly but held firm. I need to report an incident. A flight attendant on United Airlines Flight 2456 just physically assaulted me. She slapped me across the face hard enough to leave a mark. There are approximately 40 witnesses, and at least a dozen passengers recorded it on their phones. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Marcus Carter's voice came back, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Say that again slowly, son. A flight attendant put her hands on you? Yes, sir. Her name tag says Susan Richardson. I politely told her she'd given me orange juice instead of the apple juice I'd ordered, and she began yelling at me about respect and talking back. When I tried to explain, she slapped me. Then she threatened to do it again when I said I was going to call you. Put me on speakerphone, Julian. And someone better put that flight attendant on this call right now. Julian raised the phone higher, and Captain Rodriguez appeared from the cockpit, having been summoned by his crew. His face was grim as he took in the scene, the red mark on Julian's face, Susan's guilty expression, the passengers recording everything. This is Captain Rodriguez. Who am I speaking with? This is Marcus Carter, Senior Advisor to the President and Director of the Department of Transportation Safety Oversight Committee. Captain, did one of your crew members just assault my 11-year-old son? Captain Rodriguez's face went pale. He looked at Susan, then at Julian, then at the phone's recording. Sir, I'm just being made aware of the situation. I need a moment to... You don't have a moment, Captain. You have a crew member who committed federal assault on a minor aboard your aircraft. That plane doesn't move an inch until this is resolved. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Captain Rodriguez turned to Susan, and his expression was devastated. Susan, did you strike this child? Susan's mouth worked soundlessly. Every excuse, every justification, every lie she'd been constructing died in her throat because she knew the truth was already out there, recorded on a dozen phones, witnessed by 40 people, undeniable and damning. It wasn't like that, Susan finally managed. He was being disrespectful and You just what? Marcus's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. You just decided to hit a child? My child? Captain Rodriguez, I want that woman removed from the aircraft immediately. I want her badge number. I want her employee file. And I want to know why United Airlines employs someone who thinks physical violence against children is an appropriate response to a beverage correction. Julian stood there, phone in hand, watching Susan Richardson's world collapse in real time. Around him, passengers were whispering, Googling, making connections they should have made earlier. Oh my God, someone breathed. That's Marcus Carter's son. The Marcus Carter. The one who just testified about airline safety violations last month. He's the kid of a federal judge, too, another passenger added, their phone showing Judge Simone Carter's photo. His mom literally handles civil rights cases. The weight of who Julian was, who his parents were, and what power he actually had access to settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Susan looked like she might be sick, her face cycling from white to gray as the full scope of her mistake became clear. Please, Susan whispered, looking at Julian with desperate eyes. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know. That's the problem, Julian interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying. You didn't think it mattered who I was. You saw a black child and thought you could hit me without consequences. You thought I was powerless. You thought wrong. Captain Rodriguez had his radio out, calling for airport security, his own career likely flashing before his eyes as he calculated how this incident would reflect on his oversight. Gate agents were rushing onto the aircraft. Other crew members stood frozen, horrified. And through it all, Marcus Carter's voice continued from the speaker, making calls, giving orders, setting in motion a response that would end not just Susan Richardson's career but would trigger a Department of Transportation investigation into United's crew training, disciplinary procedures, and pattern of discrimination complaints. Julian, Marcus said, his professional voice giving way to a father's concern, I need you to stay on the plane. I'm 20 minutes from the airport. Airport police are being dispatched now. Do not let anyone pressure you to minimize what happened. Do you understand? Yes, sir. And son, I'm proud of you for speaking up. I'm proud of how you handled yourself. But I'm so sorry you had to. Julian's composure finally cracked, tears streaming freely now. Dad, I just wanted to go visit Michael. I just wanted a normal weekend. I know, baby. I know. And in those words, everyone in that cabin heard the truth. Julian Carter was extraordinary, yes, articulate and brave and powerful in ways that defied his age. But he was also just an 11-year-old boy who wanted to visit his friend, who'd been excited about a weekend of fishing and freedom, who'd done nothing to deserve being assaulted except exist while black in a space where someone decided he didn't belong. Susan Richardson was being led off the aircraft by security, still trying to explain, still trying to minimize, still not understanding that the moment she'd struck Julian Carter, she'd sealed her own fate. But more than that, she'd proven exactly what Julian had accused her of, that she saw black children as acceptable targets for violence, that she believed her authority gave her the right to harm, that she'd gotten away with it before and expected to get away with it again. This time, she'd hit the wrong child. And the consequences were going to be devastating. As airport security escorted Susan Richardson down the aisle, she suddenly wrenched herself free from their grip, spinning back toward Julian with wild eyes. Her carefully maintained professional facade had shattered completely, replaced by the raw desperation of someone watching 17 years of career security evaporate in minutes. This isn't fair. Susan's voice cracked, echoing through the cabin. You're destroying my life over a misunderstanding. I barely touched you. You're exaggerating because you know who your father is. This is abuse of power. Julian stood his ground, still holding his phone with his father on speaker, still surrounded by passengers who'd finally found their voices and their courage. Ma'am, Julian said, his voice steady despite fresh tears on his cheeks, you hit me hard enough that my face is still burning. You did it in front of 40 witnesses. You did it on camera. And now you're trying to lie about it because you finally realize there will be consequences. I was disciplining you. Susan shrieked, all pretense of rationality gone. Children need discipline. Especially children who think they can talk to adults however they want. Your generation has no respect, no understanding of authority, and someone needs to teach you. The businessman from 2C stood up, his voice shaking with anger. Lady, he asked about a drink order. That's not disrespect. That's not talking back. That's a kid politely pointing out a mistake. And you hit him. You hit him. Other passengers joined in, and the floodgates finally opened. I have a son his age. If a flight attendant laid hands on him, I'd press charges immediately. She's been rude the entire boarding process. I watched her snap at 3 different passengers before this. This is assault. Clear as day. She needs to be arrested, not just fired. Susan looked around the cabin wildly, searching for any sympathy, any support, finding only hostile faces and recording phones. Her desperation transformed into vindictive rage. You're all being manipulated. Susan's voice reached a pitch that made people wince. Can't you see what's happening? This boy and his powerful parents are going to ruin my career, take away my pension, and destroy my reputation, all because I tried to maintain order on this aircraft. This is what's wrong with America. Connected people get away with everything while working-class people like me get thrown away. You're not being thrown away for being working class. A black woman in row 3 spoke up, her voice cutting through Susan's hysteria. You're being held accountable for putting your hands on a child. There's a difference. How dare you? Susan whirled on her. You don't know what it's like to deal with passengers who think they're entitled to everything. Who questions every decision? Who makes this job impossible? Passengers like me? The woman asked coolly. Black passengers? Is that what you mean? Susan's face went red. I never said race. You people always make everything about race. This is about respect and authority and maintaining standards. Standards like hitting children? Another passenger challenged. Captain Rodriguez tried to intervene. Susan, you need to stop talking and leave with security. You're making this worse. But Susan was beyond reason, 17 years of unchecked prejudice and protected behavior finally exploding in the open. No, everyone needs to hear this. I'm being scapegoated because I dared to discipline a child who happens to have powerful parents. If he were just some random kid, nobody would care. Nobody would even be paying attention. You're right about one thing, Julian said quietly, and his words cut through Susan's ranting. If I were just some random black kid, you probably would get away with this. My complaints would go into some HR file that nobody reads. You'd get a warning at most. And you'd keep doing this to other passengers who don't have the power to fight back. He looked around the cabin at all the passengers who were now witnesses, whose phones had captured everything. That's why this matters. Not because you hit me specifically, but because I'm probably not the first passenger you've hurt. I'm just the first one who had the resources to make you face consequences. How many other people have you done this to, ma'am? How many passengers have you slapped, pushed, grabbed, terrorized, because you thought they couldn't fight back? Susan's face went from red to white. That's not, I never, you're twisting everything. Then you won't mind when the Department of Transportation reviews your entire employment history. Marcus Carter's voice came through the phone speaker, cold and precise. Every complaint ever filed against you. Every incident report. Every passenger who felt mistreated but was too scared or too tired to push back. We're going to look at all of it. And Susan Richardson, I suspect we're going to find a pattern that makes today's assault look like the tip of a very ugly iceberg. This is a witch hunt. Susan screamed. You're out to get me. You're using your power to destroy me. No, ma'am, Julian said, his 11-year-old voice carrying more authority than Susan's 17 years of experience. You destroyed yourself. You chose to hit a child. You chose to do it where people could see. You chose to double down instead of apologize. Every choice that led to this moment was yours. I just refused to be your victim. Susan lunged toward Julian then, her hand raised, her face contorted with rage. Security caught her before she could make contact, but the intention was clear, captured on a dozen phone cameras, undeniable proof of exactly what kind of person Susan Richardson was when her authority was challenged. I'll sue you. Susan shrieked as security forcibly removed her, her voice echoing down the jetway. I'll sue your family. I'll sue United. You haven't heard the last of me. You think you can destroy my life? I'll destroy yours. I'll make you regret this. All of you. The threats continued until the aircraft door closed behind her, cutting off Susan's voice but not the impact of her meltdown. The cabin sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed, understanding that they'd just seen something that would dominate news cycles, that would be studied in training seminars, that would become a case study in what happens when unchecked prejudice meets accountability. Julian sank into his seat, the adrenaline that had kept him standing finally giving way to exhaustion. The elderly woman across the aisle handed him a tissue, her eyes kind and sad. You were so brave, sweetheart. So articulate. But you shouldn't have had to be. You should have just gotten your apple juice and had a nice flight. Julian nodded, accepting the tissue, wiping his eyes. Thank you for speaking up. You and everyone else who finally said something. It mattered. We should have spoken up sooner, the businessman admitted, shame coloring his voice. We watched her escalate, watched her get aggressive, and we told ourselves it wasn't our business. Then she hit you, and we kept our mouths shut until you stood up for yourself. An 11-year-old had more courage than any of us adults. That's going to stay with me. Other passengers murmured agreement, A collective shame settling over people who understood they'd failed in the moment that mattered most. Marcus's voice came through the phone again. Julian, airport police are boarding now. I'm 5 minutes away. You did everything right, son. Everything. But I need you to know that what you did today, standing up like that, is going to have ripples. This story is going to go public. People are going to have opinions about how you handled it, about whether you should have just stayed quiet, about whether your parents are overreacting. Are you ready for that? Julian thought about Susan's threats, about the videos spreading across social media, about becoming the face of another viral incident of racism and violence. He was 11. He should be thinking about fishing with Michael, about video games and junk food, and whether they'd stay up past midnight. Instead, he was thinking about every other black child who'd been hit, diminished, terrorized by adults who thought they could get away with it. I'm ready, Dad, Julian said. Because if my story can protect even one other kid from going through this, then it's worth it. And in that moment, everyone listening understood that Julian Carter wasn't just a victim who'd been brave. He was already an advocate, already thinking beyond his own pain to how he could prevent others from suffering the same. At 11 years old, he'd become a symbol of something powerful, that childhood didn't excuse adults from consequences, that being young didn't mean being powerless, and that sometimes the most devastating response to violence wasn't violence returned, but truth spoken so clearly that no one could ignore it. Susan Richardson was done. But the question remained. Would the system that had protected her for 17 years actually change, or would United just fire one flight attendant and continue business as usual? Marcus Carter arrived at Gate 47 exactly 4 minutes later, flanked by airport police and what looked like federal agents. He moved through the jetway with purpose, his presence commanding immediate attention. When he stepped onto the aircraft, every passenger stood instinctively, recognizing authority when they saw it. But Marcus only had eyes for his son. Julian, Marcus breathed, and in that moment, he wasn't a senior government official or a policy director. He was a father who'd just learned his child had been assaulted, and the anguish on his face made several passengers tear up. Julian ran to him, and Marcus caught him, holding his son tight while examining the red mark on his cheek with fury and heartbreak warring in his eyes. I'm okay, Dad, Julian whispered. I handled it. I stood up for myself like you and Mom taught me. You shouldn't have had to, Marcus said, his voice breaking. You're 11 years old. You should be protected, not protecting yourself from adults who are supposed to keep you safe. He turned to Captain Rodriguez, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to that controlled authority that made senators nervous. Captain, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about my son. This is about every passenger who's ever been assaulted, demeaned, or terrorized by airline staff who thought their authority gave them the right to abuse. Julian having powerful parents shouldn't be why he gets justice. Every child, every passenger deserves protection. I understand, sir, Captain Rodriguez said quietly. And I'm ashamed that this happened on my aircraft, to your son, to any passenger. Susan Richardson's behavior was inexcusable. Where is she now? Marcus asked. Airport police have her in custody. She tried to attack Julian again before they removed her. It's all on camera. Marcus's jaw tightened. But that makes the assault and battery charges even more straightforward. My wife is filing paperwork as we speak. Susan Richardson will face criminal prosecution and will be suing United Airlines for employing someone with what I suspect is a long history of complaints that were ignored. He addressed the cabin then, making eye contact with passengers who'd recorded everything. I need everyone who witnessed what happened to provide statements to airport police. Your testimonies matter. Your willingness to speak up matters. What my son experienced today happens every day to passengers who don't have the resources to fight back. We're going to make sure this case changes that. Passengers nodded, several already moving toward the officers taking statements. The businessman who defended Julian approached Marcus directly. Sir, I want to apologize. I didn't speak up fast enough. I let that woman escalate, and I should have intervened sooner. Marcus looked at him steadily. You spoke up eventually. That's more than most people do. Thank you for that. But you're right that intervention should come sooner. Silence protects abusers. Remember that next time. The man nodded, chastened but resolved. Within hours, the videos had exploded across social media. Susan Richardson's meltdown, her threats, her attempted second assault, all captured in high definition and viewed millions of times. News outlets picked up the story: government official's son assaulted by flight attendant, and 11-year-old's powerful response to airline violence stuns nation. But the most viral clip was Julian's calm, articulate dismantling of Susan's excuses. His words about knowing his worth, about refusing to be powerless, about using his privilege to protect others who didn't have his advantages, that's what resonated. That's what got shared by civil rights organizations, played in schools, and quoted by advocates. Susan Richardson was arrested on federal assault charges. United Airlines suspended her pending investigation, then terminated her within 24 hours after reviewing her complaint history, which revealed exactly what Marcus had suspected: a pattern of discriminatory behaviors spanning years, complaints from passengers of color that had been settled quietly, warnings that had gone unheeded. The Department of Transportation launched a full investigation into United's complaint handling procedures. Congress scheduled hearings. Every major airline scrambled to review its own policies, terrified of being next. And Julian Carter, who just wanted to visit his best friend for a weekend of fishing, became the face of a movement demanding that airlines actually protect passengers instead of just claiming to in their mission statements. But more than any policy change, what mattered most was what Julian had proven: that children had voices worth hearing, that courage wasn't about age or size, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply refusing to accept it. 3 days after Flight 2456, Susan Richardson sat in a holding cell at the Federal Detention Center, her 17-year career reduced to ashes, her future a dark uncertainty. The charges were staggering: federal assault and battery against a minor, child endangerment, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and attempted assault for her second lunge at Julian that security had intercepted. Her lawyer had been blunt during their consultation. "Susan, you assaulted the child of a federal judge and a presidential advisor. On camera. In front of 40 witnesses. Then you tried to hit him again. There's no defense here. The best we can hope for is a plea deal that keeps you out of federal prison." "But I barely touched him," Susan had protested weakly, clinging to the lie even as it crumbled around her. The medical report shows bruising consistent with a forceful blow. The videos show clear intent and follow-through. And your behavior afterward, the threats, the attempted second assault, that shows a pattern of violence that a jury will not sympathize with. United Airlines moved swiftly to distance itself from the scandal. Within 72 hours, they terminated Susan, revoked her flight benefits, and issued a public statement that would reshape industry standards. United Airlines has zero tolerance for employee violence against passengers. Susan Richardson's actions were criminal, unconscionable, and completely contrary to our values. We have terminated her employment and are cooperating fully with federal prosecutors. Additionally, we are implementing the Julian Carter Passenger Protection Protocol, which includes mandatory de-escalation training, body cameras for all crew members, and an independent review board for all complaints involving minors or allegations of discrimination. But the most devastating consequences came from Susan's own community. Her daughter posted an open letter that went viral. "That woman who slapped an 11-year-old on a plane is my mother. I'm writing to say I'm ashamed. I've watched her display casual cruelty my whole life, dismissing it as being strict or maintaining standards. But seeing it on camera, seeing her hit a child, then try to justify it, I can't make excuses anymore. To Julian Carter, I'm sorry. You showed more grace and courage than my mother showed in her entire career." Susan's own child had publicly disowned her, and the letter had 12 million views in 24 hours. Meanwhile, Julian Carter had become a reluctant hero. He'd given one interview to a major news network, and his composure had stunned the nation. "I don't want to be famous for being hit," Julian had said, sitting beside his parents. "I just want people to understand that standing up to injustice isn't about being brave or special. It's about knowing you have worth and refusing to let anyone take that from you. Every kid deserves that. Every person deserves that." The interviewer had asked if he forgave Susan Richardson. Julian had thought carefully before answering. I don't know if I forgive her yet. I'm 11. I'm still processing being assaulted by an adult who was supposed to keep me safe. But I hope she learns something. I hope she understands that black children aren't acceptable targets for violence. That we're not threats to be managed or problems to be disciplined. We're just kids who deserve the same respect anyone else does. The clip had been viewed 50 million times. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Parents showed it to their children. It became a touchstone for conversations about standing up to authority, about knowing your rights, about the power of articulate, principled resistance. Marcus and Simone Carter had been offered a settlement from United Airlines. A substantial financial payout, NDAs for everyone involved, a quiet resolution that would make the problem disappear from headlines. Marcus had declined publicly. We're not taking settlement money. We're taking this to trial. Settlements protect airlines from accountability while doing nothing to protect future passengers. Julian didn't stand up to Susan Richardson just to let the system that enabled her continue unchallenged. The decision sent shockwaves through the airline industry. No settlement meant discovery. Meant depositions. Meant every complaint against Susan Richardson, every ignored warning, every passenger who'd been mistreated would become part of the public record. Other airlines scrambled to implement reforms before their own patterns of ignored complaints could be examined. Susan Richardson's lawyer advised her to plead guilty and hope for leniency. She refused initially, convinced she could convince a jury she'd been defending herself against a disrespectful child. Then her lawyer showed her the jury selection polls. Showed her that 92% of potential jurors who'd seen the video believed she was guilty. Showed her that her best-case scenario was 3 years in federal prison, worst scenario was 7. Susan finally broke. Finally understood that hitting Julian Carter had cost her everything. Her career. Her reputation. Her daughter's respect. Her freedom. All because she'd seen a black child who spoke with confidence and decided he needed to be put in his place. She entered a guilty plea on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison, 5 years of probation, mandatory anger management and bias training, and a permanent ban from working in any customer-facing role in aviation. As Susan was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Julian sat in the gallery with his parents, watching justice served but feeling hollowed out rather than victorious. Is it supposed to feel like this? Julian asked his father quietly. Like I won, but I'm still sad? Marcus pulled his son close. Justice doesn't erase trauma, son. It just means the person who hurt you faces consequences. The healing part? That takes longer. But you did something important. You stood up. You spoke out. And you made it harder for the next Susan Richardson to get away with hurting the next child. Julian nodded, understanding intellectually, even if emotionally, that he still felt the sting of that slap, still carried the weight of having to defend himself when he should have been protected. But he also understood something profound, that his courage had mattered, that his voice had changed systems, that being 11 years old hadn't stopped him from demanding dignity and getting it. That was worth something. Even if the victory felt complicated. Have you ever watched someone face real consequences for violence against a child and wondered if it actually changed anything? Susan Richardson is going to prison, but how many other Susan Richardsons are still working, still carrying prejudices, just smart enough not to hit someone on camera? Does one person's punishment change culture, or does it just make abusers more careful? What do you think? Is this justice, or just one battle won in a much longer war? 6 months after Flight 2456, Julian Carter sat in his family's living room in Washington, D.C., working on a school project about civil rights. His assignment was to write about a personal experience that taught him something important about justice and equality. He'd been staring at the blank document for 20 minutes. Writer's block. His mother, Judge Simone Carter, appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, settling beside him on the couch. I don't know how to write about it without it sounding like I'm bragging, Julian admitted. Like, yeah, I stood up to that flight attendant, but only because I had parents with power. Most kids can't do what I did. So what's the lesson? Simone set down the mugs and took her son's hands. The lesson isn't that you had powerful parents, baby. The lesson is that you knew your worth even before you knew help was coming. You stood up for yourself first. The power came after. But would it have mattered if Dad wasn't who he is? Julian asked the question that had been haunting him for months. If I were just some random black kid, would Susan Richardson have faced any consequences? Or would my complaint have disappeared into some file that nobody reads? Probably the latter, Simone said honestly, because she'd never lied to her son about how the world worked. And that's the injustice we're trying to fix. That's why your father pushed for the Julian Carter Passenger Protection Protocol. So the next black child who gets assaulted doesn't need a federal judge for a mother to get justice. Julian pulled up something on his laptop, showing his mother an email. I got this yesterday. From a kid in Texas named DeMarco. He's 12. A teacher grabbed him and shook him at school, and he was scared to report it. But then he watched the video of me on the plane, and he told his parents what happened. The teacher got fired. He said I gave him courage. Simone's eyes filled with tears. That's the lesson, Julian. That's what matters. Not that you had powerful parents, but that you used your voice and it inspired others to use theirs. Over the next hour, Julian showed his mother more emails. Dozens of them. From children who'd experienced racism, from parents who'd taught their kids about standing up for themselves, from teachers who used his story to discuss civil rights and personal dignity. One letter, from a girl named Amara in Chicago, particularly moved them both. I'm 11 like you. Last week, a store security guard accused me of stealing when I hadn't taken anything. I was so scared, but I remembered how you stayed calm and used your words on that plane. So I asked to see the manager, explained what happened, and showed them I hadn't stolen anything. The security guard got in trouble, not me. Thank you for showing me that kids can stand up for themselves. See, Simone said softly, you didn't just get justice for yourself. You modeled how to demand dignity for everyone who watched. Marcus joined them, having overheard from his home office. Julian, can I tell you something I've never told you? When I was your age, a teacher hit me. Slapped me across the face for correcting her about a historical fact. I told my parents, but nothing happened. The teacher said I'd been disrespectful, and her word was believed over mine. I carried that shame, that powerlessness, for years. Julian looked at his father with wide eyes. You never told me that. Because it hurt. Because I felt like I'd failed somehow, like if I'd just been quieter, smaller, less confident, maybe she wouldn't have hit me. Marcus's voice was thick with emotion. But watching you on that plane, seeing you refuse to shrink, seeing you demand accountability, you did what I couldn't do. You broke a cycle. But Dad, you have so much power now. You could have stood up if you wanted to. Could I? Marcus asked gently. I was a black child in Alabama in the 1980s. The system wasn't designed to protect me. It was designed to punish me for existing with confidence. You standing up on that plane wasn't just about Susan Richardson. It was about every black child who's been hit, diminished, or silenced. You said enough. And the world listened. Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing his father's words, understanding that his story was connected to a much longer, deeper history of black children being targeted for daring to take up space. What if I hadn't had you and Mom to back me up? Julian asked. What if I'd been alone? You weren't alone, Simone said firmly. You had 40 witnesses. You had passengers who finally spoke up. You had your own knowledge of your rights. Yes, our positions helped. But your courage came first. Your refusal to be a victim came first. The power followed the courage, not the other way around. Julian finally started typing his essay, titled, The Day I Learned That Silence Protects Oppressors. He wrote about the slap, yes, but more importantly, he wrote about the 40 passengers who'd stayed silent at first. About how their eventual testimonies had mattered, but how their initial silence had prolonged his suffering. About how change required more than just victims speaking up. It required witnesses choosing to see, to acknowledge, to act. The essay won first place in his school's competition and was later published in a national education journal. But more than any award, what mattered were the responses Julian received from readers. Teachers wrote to say they'd used his story to discuss bystander intervention with students. Parents wrote to say they'd taught their children about standing up to injustice because of what Julian had modeled. Flight attendants wrote to say they'd reported colleagues for discriminatory behavior they'd previously ignored. One letter, from a United Airlines flight attendant named Maria, particularly resonated. "I worked with Susan Richardson for 5 years. I saw her be harsh with passengers of color. I heard her make comments that made me uncomfortable. But I never reported her because I didn't want to be labeled a troublemaker. Your courage in standing up to her made me realize my silence was complicity. I'm not staying silent anymore. Thank you for showing me that even kids can be braver than adults." Julian kept that letter in his desk drawer, pulling it out on hard days when he wondered if speaking up had been worth the trauma, the publicity, the loss of privacy that came with becoming a symbol. Because the truth was, Julian still had nightmares sometimes. Still flinched when flight attendants approached him on planes. Still carried the psychological weight of being assaulted by an adult who was supposed to protect him. Justice didn't erase trauma. Consequences for Susan Richardson didn't undo what she'd done to him. The new protocols and policies didn't change the fact that an 11-year-old had been forced to defend himself when adults should have done it for him. But his courage had created ripples. His voice had inspired others. His refusal to accept abuse had made it fractionally harder for the next Susan Richardson to get away with violence. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what justice looked like. Not perfect, not complete, but real and measurable and moving incrementally toward a world where Black children could exist with confidence without being seen as threats deserving of violence. Susan Richardson had tried to diminish Julian Carter because his confidence challenged her prejudices. Instead, she'd created an advocate, a voice, a symbol of resistance that would outlast her career, her reputation, her freedom. Julian had taken the worst moment of his young life and transformed it into a lesson millions would learn from. That was power. Real, lasting, meaningful power. And no slap could take that away. 1 year after Flight 2456, Julian Carter finally took that trip to visit his best friend, Michael. Same route, same airline, deliberately choosing not to let fear win. When he boarded the plane and settled into his seat, the flight attendant who approached him smiled warmly. "You're Julian Carter, aren't you?" she asked gently. "I just want you to know, your courage changed everything for us. We have better training now. Better protocols. And we're not staying silent anymore when we see discrimination. Thank you for that." Julian nodded, accepting her words but still carrying the weight of what it had cost him to create that change. He was 12 now, taller, his voice deeper, but the red mark from Susan Richardson's slap still lived in his memory even though it had long faded from his face. As the plane took off, Julian looked out the window at the clouds below and thought about all the letters he'd received, all the children who'd found their voices because he'd used his, all the witnesses who'd learned to intervene instead of just recording. Susan Richardson was in federal prison, serving her sentence, supposedly taking bias training and anger management classes. Whether she'd actually changed or just learned to hide her prejudices better remained unknown. But she'd never work in aviation again. She'd never have authority over vulnerable passengers again. That mattered. Julian had learned something profound over the past year, that justice was complicated, that trauma didn't have neat resolutions, that standing up for yourself was necessary but exhausting, that being brave didn't mean you weren't also wounded. But he'd also learned that silence protected oppressors, that witnesses had power if they chose to use it, and that even children could shift systems when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. He'd taken a slap meant to diminish him and turned it into a voice that echoed across an entire industry. That was a transformation. That was resistance. That was the kind of power Susan Richardson had never imagined when she decided a confident Black child needed to be put in his place. Julian Carter hadn't stayed in his place. He'd claimed his space, demanded his dignity, and shown millions of people watching that sometimes the most devastating response to violence wasn't violence returned but truth spoken so clearly that no one could ignore it. And that lesson would outlive the incident, would outlive Susan Richardson's sentence, would outlive even Julian's own memory of pain. Because courage was contagious. And Julian had proven it could live in an 11-year-old just as powerfully as it lived in adults. Now it's your turn to reflect honestly and engage deeply with what you've witnessed. Do you think racial discrimination and prejudice can truly end, or will they always adapt, finding new ways to express themselves, new victims to target, new systems to hide within? What do you believe needs to happen in airlines, schools, workplaces, everywhere, to curb this poison that's infected our society for generations? Do you think serving justice to individual racists like Susan Richardson is enough, or does the entire system need dismantling and rebuilding from the foundation up? More importantly, what would you have done in Julian's position? At 11 years old, facing down an adult who just physically assaulted you, would you have had the courage to stand your ground and demand accountability? And as one of those 40 passengers on Flight 2456, would you have been the businessman who eventually spoke up? Or would you have been one of the silent majority who recorded but didn't intervene until a child shamed you into action? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about times you've witnessed adults abuse their authority against children, particularly Black children who are so often seen as threats rather than innocents deserving protection. What did you do? What do you wish you'd done differently? If you want racism to become a thing of the past in our country and world at large, if you want to be like Julian Carter, using your voice to educate, to advocate, to refuse silence in the face of injustice even when it's scary and costly, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can amplify these stories. Together, we can create accountability where silence once protected abusers. Together, we can build a world where 11-year-old children can ask for the right drink order without being assaulted, where confidence in Black bodies is celebrated rather than punished, and where witnesses choose courage over comfort. Thank you for watching Julian Carter's journey from victim to advocate. Thank you for caring enough to make it to the end. And thank you for being part of the solution, because change starts with people like you deciding that adult violence against children is never acceptable, that racism disguised as discipline is still racism, and proving it with your actions every single day. The fight isn't over. Susan Richardson is in prison, but the mindset that made her think she could hit a child without consequences still exists in countless others. But we're winning, one brave voice at a time, one policy change at a time, one person who chooses to intervene rather than record at a time. See you in the next story. And remember, when you see injustice, especially against children, don't just bear witness. Stop it. Speak up. Intervene. Because your voice, yes, yours, has more power than you know. Julian Carter was 11 years old, and he changed an entire industry. Imagine what you could do. Together, we're not just witnessing change. We're creating it.